Measurements. Any review without measurements is not a review. It's just a puff piece paid for by the manufacturer. An ad, in other words. So, I made a video recently dishing the dirt on YouTube reviewers who are given equipment free to review, but they don't declare that their video contains a paid promotion. YouTube's terms are, if you receive anything of value, you have to declare it, and YouTube will place a banner or card on your video and thumbnail to tell viewers that the review might not be totally uninfluenced. Anyway, that's one thing, and I've put a link down below. Prepare to be shocked. But among the comments which were interesting, one thread was that reviewers don't need just to talk about the product they are reviewing, they need to measure it. Okay. So, I have done this previously for a couple of items. I've also demonstrated some of my review items with audio. Sometimes I just talk about the facilities, functionality, and what kind of use you might put the product to. I don't have a format. I make my reviews in whatever way interests me in the moment. The great thing about YouTube is that for any product, there will be several reviews any potential purchaser can consider. No one review needs to be complete in itself. Anyway, measurements. How much would it cost me to make detailed, precise, reliable measurements? Well, if I go to the Audio Precision website, Audio Precision being a noted audio test equipment brand, the clue is in the name, I don't see prices. I have to ask for a quote, and as the saying goes, if you have to ask the price, you can't afford it. A quick look at eBay, however, tells me that I could have a second-hand Audio Precision APX525 for 10,500 Great British pounds, or best offer. You know something? I won't be going there. There are more affordable test sets from other manufacturers, so hey, you never know. But I am going to take a measurement today of the Aiyima T9 Pro power amplifier. I forgot to unbox it. Okay, this seems a bit messy on first open, but it's probably a review sample, and what you buy will hopefully be a bit neater. So, if I'm going to measure something, what might I measure? Well, I could measure the power output, I've done that before, but I'm going to ask you just to check the spec and remember that power amps are commonly specified in the most flattering way possible. I'll make a video on this point at some point. I could measure the frequency response. In this day and age, anyone might expect it to be ruler flat, but it does seem that there may be something to look into here, in general, not necessarily referring to the T9 Pro. Again, a future video. Noise. Who's heard any noise from a power amp lately? Apparently, some YouTube reviewers have. Probably a fault condition, but if I ever hear any, I'll certainly tell you. So, what's left? Well, minor niggly issues, maybe, but the big one, potentially the big one, is distortion. Now, in a properly designed amplifier, distortion should be completely and absolutely inaudible. Yes, there will be some even when the amp is working well within its limits, but so low down that not even Audio Phil can hear it. He thinks he can, but he can't. Well, I think he can't. But do you notice those knobbly bits on the top of the T9 Pro? Thermionic tubes, vacuum tubes, valves, take your pick. Tubes. I'll stick with tubes. Tubes, as we know, were superseded by transistors in the 1960s. I could say that talking about frequency response, noise and distortion, power output too, transistors were simply better. Or perhaps transistor equipment was better at a cheaper price point or smaller size. Commenters may discuss, if you like. The difference is, however, is that both transistor and tube amplifiers can be designed to have very low distortion. I could quote the famously advertised 0.1% of leak products. But if there is distortion, then transistor distortion sounds perfectly dreadful. Tube distortion can sound quite nice. So, this, you would think, is the point of the T9 Pro having tubes. Tubes can create nice-sounding distortion. I'll just throw in here that the tubes in the T9 Pro and similar amps are not driving the output. That's the Class D amplifier chip at the butt end. The tubes are an extra in the signal path to give us lots of lovely warmthness. So, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to run the signal through a spectrograph. This will allow me to measure the level of the distortion, and we'll also see what harmonics are generated. At this point, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm hoping that I'll see and possibly hear some distortion. At safe levels, of course. I don't want to hear clipping. Okay, right. I'm a YouTuber, but now I'm going to imitate what they do on the telly and skip to a different topic. I'll come back to the distortion later. What do I think about the facilities and functions of this amp? Okay, the inputs. Bluetooth, RCA, coaxial digital, optical digital and USB. Oddly, an old-fashioned USB-B rather than the more current USB-C. Small point though. Old-school USB is easily fast enough for stereo digital audio. Digitally, the T9 Pro can handle up to 192 kHz and, of course, 24 bits. No talk of DSD, so fans of that will have to look elsewhere. Speaker outputs, spade, banana, bare ends. OK, subwoofer output, check. Now, it's the front that's going to catch people's attention. What we need is an on-off switch and a volume control, often in other amps, combined into one knob. But what we have in addition to our needs is a lovely VU meter. I say lovely because it actually is. Whether it conforms to the official VU meter specs isn't particularly relevant. You get a display that the amp is working, how hard it's working, and the meter itself is almost a thing of beauty. And as well as the needle swinging back and forth, you get to see the coil swinging inside. I could watch it all day. In the display on the left, we have a bit of a sound to light going on that doesn't tell you any more than the VU, so a bit pointless. If you have young eyes or really powerful reading glasses, and I'm not kidding, you can see which input you've selected and the sample rate if relevant. Am I waffling about nothing much? Maybe, but I'm not going to waffle now. In the centre of the display, you can see what volume level you've set. Volume level, is that a tautology? No. And I'll probably tell you why in a future video. Anyway, knowing what volume level you've set is critical in professional audio, which is why wax pencils were invented. In the recording studio, for instance, consistency is key. Changes in volume can affect your judgment massively, and keeping a consistent monitoring level really does help. To go with this very useful display, the volume control is detented. It goes round and round, so it's a digital rotary encoder. Suits me down to the ground. This and the volume level display is why it's the T9 Pro. IMHO. Also what suits me is that the on-off switch, which is also the input selector, is separate. Other manufacturers should take note of this. OK, that's it for that. Back to the measurements. What I'm going to do is run a 100 Hz sine wave into the T9 Pro. I'm going to take the output from the aux output, which I imagine most people who use it will use it to drive a subwoofer. It is controlled by the volume knob. I'm doing this A, because I don't want to blow anything up, and B, because the tubes are not the output devices. That is a Texas Instruments chip. The tubes are there to colour the sound, and, indeed, the sound from the aux out is coloured. This is what I get. Here's the original sine wave into my spectrograph. This is exactly what we expect, and spectrograph enthusiasts might care to comment further, in the comments, why it isn't just an infinitely thin vertical line. Now, here's what we see from the T9 Pro. We see the original 100 Hz tone, nudging up to minus 10 dB. We also see 200 Hz and 300 Hz. Above that, nothing. So we can get from this a rough percentage. The original tone is at minus 10 dB, the second harmonic is at around minus 72 dB, so 62 dB down. The third harmonic is lower, and I'll ignore it. What does this figure of 62 dB mean? Well, if you know your decibels, you know that 20 dB is times 10, 40 dB times 100, 60 dB times 1,000. So, minus 62 dB is a little less than 1,000th, 0.1%, 0.1. Remember that leak 0.1 amplifier I mentioned earlier? The point of 0.1, if you like, is that distortion at this level is inaudible. 0.1. What's the point? Indeed, Aiyima's specifications state total harmonic distortion 0.03%. That's less than my measurement, but I'd guess that the measurement method would account for that. RMS versus peak kind of thing. Really, this is the point. I keep using that word. Of the comments section because people will have different opinions on this. To my ears, 0.1% distortion is inaudible. But maybe some people can hear it. I certainly wouldn't say that it's impossible. Unlikely, but maybe not impossible. Then, of course, any harmonic distortion is a precursor to intermodulation distortion. Harmonic distortion can be pleasant. Intermodulation distortion usually is not, unless you regard it as some kind of interesting texture. And then there's the question of whether distortion equals warmth, warmth equals distortion, or is warmth something different to distortion? And even though this amp has a very low distortion figure, the tubes add warmth in some way. I like science, and I'd say no. But I certainly wouldn't want to silence anyone's opinion. So if you think that warmth isn't the same thing as distortion, please let us know. You know something? That's it. See you soon.
It's not a question of hearing distortion. If it's there, it's there. If it's there, it isn't right. If it isn't right, I'll know it isn't right. And if I know it isn't right, then I'll hear it.